Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second video cast or podcast, I'm not sure what you would call this, of the Open University's Gender Critical Research Network. This time we've actually got video because I figured out how to press the video record setting. This time, rather than having a panel discussion, I thought it would be really useful and helpful for us to chat with one of our members of the network, Dr. Laura McGrath, who sits within the psychology department. So welcome, Laura. Thank you for taking part in this.
Hi, thanks for asking me.
Yeah, and we've got some questions that I'm going to ask. The podcast will be around 20 to 30 minutes. So we're going to start with where we left off, if you like, from the last audio cast. And that's this. Laura, what does sex bodies mean to you in the context of your research?
Thanks, Joe. So, yeah, as you said, I'm a psychology researcher, and specifically I do qualitative research, so talking to people about their lives and then using theory and literature to make sense of those psychological experiences. And my research has mainly been in the area of mental health. And a lot of it is focused on the role of materiality in psychological experience. So by materiality, I mean objects, spaces and places where we are, and of course our bodies as the material object through which we experience the world. So when I was thinking about why I've ended up thinking about sex bodies in this way, I was reflecting back to think about why I was drawn to thinking about materiality in the first place. And I think when I first started studying psychology, there were kind of two main paradigms that were being taught. So one was cognitive psychology, which broadly conceptualises psychology as information processing. And the other was social constructionism, which views reality as constructed through discourse. So this was the kind of tail end of the turn to language, which kind of dominated social theory in the 90s in particular. But both of these approaches to me seemed to offer something, but be ultimately quite hollow accounts of people. So they're both very disembodied, as though our kind of psychological lives sort of float above the material world rather than being embedded within it and emergent from it.
Can I just ask a question? When you say the material world, I know that you said it's, bodies, places, objects. Do you mean those things that come at us through our senses that you can kind of like touch, see, smell, hold? Yeah,
and the material conditions that we live in as well. So everything that we are always located and always embodied, and psychology is not particularly good at thinking about those things. So one of the things that I couldn't see that full messiness of human experience, as you say, what comes in through the senses and also what exists outside of us as well, and kind of exists there for us to engage with and to make sense of as we move through the world. So that meant, because of that, I was very drawn to theory at the time looking at embodiment, which was around quite a lot then. Some of it is influenced by phenomenology, which started to think about how our experiences are both kind of fleshy, embodied and sensate, as well as being constituted in culture and discourse. So those things aren't necessarily separate, but always kind of interrelating when we think about things on the level of our psychological experiences. And through that, I became interested in these other kinds of material contexts, so spaces and places, which is what I focused on in my PhD. Kind of the role of material space in mental health, including objects, so objects that you have around you and how people make sense of those and add meaning to them and use them to make sense of their experiences, and also material conditions like poverty and housing, and the broader kind of sense of materiality. So thinking about the relationship of all of those in our psychological experience, and what I think joins those together as well as materiality is that they are pretty much often marginalized in psychological theory. That's got less true. So there's quite a lot of research now in embodied cognition, for instance, thinking about how our cognition is different in different places for different purposes. It's definitely a good development. But still, there's this persistent dualism in psychology, which prioritizes the immaterial above the material, rather than seeing them as interwoven. So you're kind of always thinking about a mind that's disembodied and kind of is doing the action, whereas the body is sort of just doing what it's told. So that's a kind of classic dualism.
Yeah.
So I suppose as I've gone on and started to read more feminism, I think that you can also see this through the idea of transcendence and immanence as well.
Right.
So this is from de Beauvoir, who of course generally was very down on immanence and wanted to run off to transcendence with the men. But that aside, I think she was onto something, in that she identified that immanence, meaning the material body, cyclical, is coded as female and devalued, whilst transcendence, meaning kind of abstract and material, the infinite, is coded as male and valued.
Okay.
And thinking about this, I think that a lot of social theory kind of tends towards transcendence and finds it hard to sit with the body without kind of going off into the abstract and thinking about fluidity and transcendence. So I think this is quite interesting. A good example of that is affect theory, for instance, which has been very dominant in social theory from about 2008-10 onwards.
Affect theory being emotions?
Well, I think what's interesting is that basically it's about emotion, embodied experience and motion. That's where it started, but it became this kind of very widely adopted social theory when people started talking about affect not as an embodied experience at all, but as this abstract force which circulates around and moves like a cloud that kind of attaches to people and objects and is something that exists not in the body at all, but kind of between bodies and between people. So since it became disembodied in this way, it became seen as this kind of proper theory and that you know, we can do in conferences and stuff. So thinking about that, I think that's quite interesting. As from my work in this area, I work so often thinking about people living with difficult experiences, trying to live with distress, for instance, or with grief. I think there's something about materiality which is a bit awkward. It's stubborn, it provides limits. So our bodies have limits and our limits as well. So we have certain physical capacities, we don't have other physical capacities. You know, I can't run in the same way that Usain Bolt can run because we have different bodies and I never will be able to. And also those capacities can change. So what we can do with our bodies changes. So for instance, a big example of that is illness and also aging. Thinking about those kind of capacities, Javi Corral, the philosopher, talks about how the body, we experience the body as transparent until we're ill, when it suddenly becomes really visible to us because of our newly limited capacity, because we're not able to do the things that we used to be able to do. And suddenly the body becomes this thing that's really visible in our lives. And similarly, our kind of material surroundings afford us different capacities and experiences and prevent others from happening. So in lockdown, for instance, if you think about the difference of having a garden or not having a garden, that's a material limit on your capacity to be able to have certain experiences or not. If you have money, that's another capacity that enables you to do things or not do things. So this is a kind of quite a long-winded way of saying...
No, it's really, I'm with you.
So I've never really understood why some of these things are seen as psychological and others of these things aren't seen as psychological. When every experience that we're having happens to a person with a body in a place, with a particular body in a particular place. And these material things often place limits on the kinds of psychological experiences which are possible. And that's not to say that's simple or deterministic, because we all make meaning in ways that are not predictable, or, you know, we can use imagination, which is like an additional capacity to change the places where we are. But still our material context, to some extent, always delineates the psychological lives that we're going to have, and that includes the kinds of bodies that we live in. So yes, this is a long way around of getting to talking about sexed bodies, but what I kind of wanted to talk about is that I think there's a tendency in both wider culture and academia to try and downplay the body and to find ways to transcend it or escape it, or talk about how it's fluid or it's porous or it's all of these different things, in order to kind of not stick with actually our kind of fleshy bodily experiences when we're talking about our theories or building our academic kind of theories around them. So I think it's really important. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay. And forgive me for just jumping in. Some of what you say is sparking off ideas. Some of it is just a little kind of point of clarification as we're running along. So am I right then in kind of summarizing what you're saying as part of what you're interested in, part of your, if you like, your domain assumptions around your academic work, is that when we begin analyzing whatever the field is that you wish to analyze, there is a need for specificity. You know, and part of your I mean, as a sociologist or a criminologist, mine might be time, you know, and social place, you know. But for you, part of your call for specificity is this, as you put it, this fleshy thing that does things that we may not expect, or you know, that we have to encounter at least. Is that a correct summary?
Yeah, exactly. And you know, so that's one part of, and obviously from in psychology, we're kind of interested in lots of the same things as sociology, but as it comes into individual experience, you know, as it kind of is refracted through our individual everyday lives. And for that, I think you can never escape body. And maybe we can in other ways, you know, through other kinds of culture and imagination. But in terms of our psychology, I think that we can never ignore it. So yeah, that's why I think it's really important to have a group of research kind of culture that centres that kind of the body and the sexed body as a kind of, again, a further specificity of what kind of capacities do you have from being female and male, and what kind of capacities aren't there, and then how do people make sense of trying to navigate those bodies in the world.
Yeah. Can I ask you another, this is a bit of a theoretical question, and I hope to ask everybody that we do interviews with over the course of the summer. One of the things that I kind of think about when asked about the importance of the sex body, or why is it that I'm even interested in the sex body, given, you know, some of the hot political climate that we're existing within. And, you know, of course, I've had a lot of people say to me things like, but, you know, sex is on a spectrum, and you know, all of those arguments. And, you know, I'm not downplaying them, but one of the things that always strikes me is, of course, our bodies have limits. We die.
Yeah.
You know, so we're on a limited time clock. So, you know, and all of everything that you've just said. But also, if we act as though this fleshy thing that's holding us is real, then it becomes real in its effects anyway. Do you know what I mean? So it's kind of like, and I should imagine that's true. I mean, I'm dying to hear about, you know, how you apply this in kind of research domains, but it strikes me that question of the flesh that we exist within and what it can do, that's a really elegant way of looking at sex differences, you know, sexual differentiation, for lack of better words, really. Yes, am I correct?
Yeah, and also I think then, if we think about it in those ways that, you know, we're all people with bodies with capacities, we don't have to get into this, you know, is it binary, is it a spectrum, is it, you know, which are kind of used in all of these different rhetorical ways, in ways that, and every time either of those, because, you know, sex isn't a strict binary, but I would think it's also not a spectrum, but, you know, I think that we can get away from some, which always kind of downplay some people's experiences and kind of center other people's for rhetorical purposes of whatever stripe they might be. So yeah, I think that's a way of trying of moving a bit beyond some of that rhetoric.
Yeah, sorry, my phone is going. I'm just trying to turn it off. You know, I did the mistake of please turn your phones off and didn't turn my own phone off. So, so how does this apply in the context of your work? Do you want to talk us through some of the areas that you're interested in, or is there more to that kind of discussion about sexualities? Yeah.
So I think probably the most, so as I said, a lot of the stuff I've done has been more generally in mental health and material context, but kind of most relevant to the group, I think, is a project that I've been working on, looking at experiences of detransition, and that's, you know,
can you, some people who are listening may not actually understand, may not know what that word is. So can you just...
Yeah, sure. So this is people who have at some point had a trans identity, meaning that they have identified as trans in some way, either, you know, as trans girl, woman, or perhaps as non-binary, any of the trans identities, and may have undergone some medical transition, so meaning taking hormones or having surgery, may have undergone social transition, which means wearing different clothes which are more kind of associated with the other sex, and or changing their name, those kind of things. People, so there's, you know, a lot of, some people don't like the term detransition because they say that you can't go back in time, you can't undo an experience that has happened. But mainly what it's used to talk about are people who have had that experience and then come to understand themselves in a different way. So usually through maybe re-identifying with their birth sex, or for some people, detransition means stop taking hormones, for instance, or start wearing kind of clothes which are more akin with their sex, but with the sort of norms for their sex. But they might still identify as transgender. So there's a kind of variety within detransition. But I think and it's a very under-researched group as well, and it's actually been very challenging finding, you know, kind of developing any research in this area, partly because it's so fraught, and people who kind of publicly talk about detransition get a lot of pushback, and so I'm very keen to talk to people who they don't know quite a lot of the time. So but that really is kind of the thing that I suppose started to interest me in this area, was noticing how much pushback there was on people who were talking about this experience, which is outside, I suppose, the dominant narrative of what it means to have a trans experience, what it means to experience what is known as gender dysphoria. So that's having a feeling that you're kind of at odds with your sex body, so that you maybe feel very distressed by, for instance, going through puberty, or that you feel like you're kind of, it's often in kind of very kind of mainstream discourse talks about as being born in the wrong body. So that kind of feeling of being kind of out and being in the wrong kind of body for yourself. So I think really one of the things that kind of pulled me into this is that I just became very intrigued because I spent a lot of time doing qualitative research, which is all about looking at people's stories and kind of narratives. It really jangled for me that there was this really simple story being told about transition, and the kind of uniformity of the story that was being told, that was out in public rhetoric. Because really, from doing qualitative research for 15 years, the only thing is that you learn very quickly is that there's never one story about any psychological experience. This is nothing to do with trans people or anything. That's just generally true. So if there was, it would be much easier to do. But actually, qualitative research is all about digging into the kind of messiness, contradiction that are there in people's narratives about their experience, about identifying kind of dominant and counter narratives. So we spend a lot of time thinking about kind of ambiguities and paradoxes in people's accounts, and how they can help kind of us understand kind of complexities in people's experiences. So people's lives are always more complex than the kind of parameters that you try to put on them. So I always find that data always surprises you, whatever previous ideas you go in with. So for that reason, when I started to hear this very coherent and simple story, that just rang a lot of bells for me, and I started to wonder about what else was happening that wasn't being told in this story. And that this uniform story that's often told, I think, is framed very similarly to sort of traditional coming out stories. So there's this idea that you sort of know from an early age something was different, you find the right explanation, sort of being trans or being gay, before being able to become a true actualized self. So in this case, through transition, in the coming out stories, often through coming out and finding gay community. So that kind of narrative, there's lots of research done on those kind of narratives and the way, the structure of them. And so it seemed very familiar. This kind of transition is framed as a kind of coming home, becoming the real self, rather than being a change, or rather than changing anything about yourself.
Can I just add in here, and it's really just a kind of illustrative point. You know, I've been out since a very, very long time, and I used to go to the Lesbian and Gay Film Festival in Bristol back in the 80s, and it was like the first or second year of the film festival, and there was this one film short, and it was about a Scottish young woman who comes out, but the title of the film was "I Came Out, It Was Raining, I Went Back In Again." Right? And it was literally that kind of. It was a little film that disturbed that progress from pain to pride, for lack of better words. So yeah, I can see exactly what you're saying there. Has parallels in so many different people's lives about so many different aspects of struggling with our identities.
Yeah, exactly. And that's also what the research shows, is that just like stories of being gay are more complicated, the stories of being trans are far more complicated than that. So lots of the literature talks about how people relate to that kind of main narrative, about how they're similar or different for them, and about how they kind of felt like they had to make sense of their experience in relation to that narrative. So one study, for instance, talks about how this is a bit unintuitive, but participants who identified as non-binary were actually more likely to tell quite a binary narrative. So saying when they were children they liked the toys that were normally associated with the opposite sex, for instance, than actually those who had a binary trans identity. So had kind of said, "Oh, now I'm a trans woman," but it's almost like maybe they're trying to justify or legitimize a kind of transness by telling this very available, very simple story that's out there. And the other thing that caught my eye really about that story is that there's a psychological theory at the center of it, and by meaning which is both a kind of medical psychological theory and also a lay theory, I think, and that's that gender dysphoria, this feeling that you're at odds with your sex body, is always a sign of misaligned gender identity, meaning, and so it means that you're trans, and that also means that transition is the answer, and that will cure you of this feeling of this gender dysphoria. So that's the kind of underlying, I suppose, theory of change that exists within this narrative.
And I suppose, we've seen that play out in public debates as well, haven't we? And I have much empathy for the critique of that medicalized model.
Yeah. And I think it's just such an unusual claim, because in psychology and, in the psychology of mental health, there is never one cause for anything, and there's never one solution for anything. So even when we have, there are some incredibly established, strong relationships in between experiences and outcomes in mental health, like childhood trauma and adult distress, or poverty and increased mental health, or, abusive relationships and PTSD. But even within those, it's not 100%. There are always people who have different responses, or for whom those experiences aren't as important, or they don't become central to their experience. And you can see that with like a natural disaster, where everybody goes through a traumatic experience, but only a minority develop a kind of trauma response from it. So that just struck me that's just not how, in terms of the kind of way in which mental health is generally thought about. And there's some people don't like seeing trans as a mental health problem, but this is just drawing on my experience of like how psychological experiences are caused and responded to. There just is never one explanation and one cause. So it seemed to me like this, I can see why this narrative is helpful in some ways. So it's very powerful. It's quite a transcendent kind of heroic narrative. So it's common, it's familiar. And for what started out being a very obscure experience, I can see why it's helpful to frame it in these very kind of familiar terms.
Yeah, and it does do that thing that, a huge number of minoritized groups politically need, and that's to provide a community, a sense of pride. So, these narratives, although they may be very simple, they also are very effective, in helping people get past being minoritized, in effect.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's all sorts of levels on which these are really useful. It's a really useful tool.
Yeah.
So it's not, and you're right as well, that it's far from the only simplified narrative. Like, that's what human culture does. We produce these simple narratives that don't represent people's experiences particularly well.
Yeah, I think all of us can think of at least 7 in the course of the last year in our lives.
Yes.
When I came out as an academic.
Yeah. But that does mean that we have to be a bit careful with them as well when they're very powerful, because there's always people with different stories. And as I said at the beginning, that's why I kind of became interested in the experiences of detransitioners, because these are the people whose stories really diverge most fundamentally from this central narrative. So I think there's lots of trans stories out there. Most of them tend to still kind of go along with the central tenets of the narrative, really, or kind of reflect that.
And I suppose, just coming back to that first question I asked, I suppose in those stories, that's also where you'll get all of that complex messiness about the materiality of a sex body, narrative, context, that sounds, and just so that the audience knows, this is research that you're planning rather than research that's currently underway.
Yes, I mean, I've been working with a bit of data with transition with some other people, but I do want to do some more detailed stuff as well, because there's one paper that's coming out hopefully in the new year, but yeah, I would hope to do a bit more detailed stuff as well. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say that about the complexity of the relationship between kind of culture and the body, and because one early account that I heard of detransition, there's lots of people putting out accounts on YouTube and Twitter and Reddit and those kind of platforms, but one account that really stuck with me was this young woman talking about how when she was identifying as a trans boy, the further along the transition journey she went, the more apparent it became to her that she wasn't male. And she said, this is so this divergent to the idea that transition is about aligning with the true self. So that obviously is an experience that some people have, and maybe many people have. But for this person, she said that she could actually pass well as male. So one of the things that girls do, that trans boys do, is bind, for instance, their breasts, so that their clothes look hang more like male clothes. I can't remember, but I think she might have been taking testosterone as well. So it was starting to look more and more male, and so adhering to kind of male appearance norms. So it was being treated in the world as though she was male.
Right.
But that's, for her, just made it seem clearer and clearer to her that she didn't actually have a male body. So especially when she was alone, she talks about just being sort of hit with her femaleness.
Oh, okay.
And I thought it was just so, there's this distance between her kind of identity and the sexed body. Transition is supposed to narrow that gap. That's kind of the theory, and I'm sure the reality for many people. Yeah. But as I was talking, but for her it became wider and wider. So I think this is an example of how materiality, our materiality body, can be this kind of limit, or at least it's something that has to be reckoned with or taken into account when you're kind of engaging in, especially this kind of identity journey. And for some people, transition might be a solution to that reckoning because they're feeling very distressed in that sex body, and transition is a solution to that distress. But I do think at very least it's a much more complicated proposition than is put forward in, again, this often strangely disembodied kind of narrative around kind of gender identity and transition. So I just think there's so much more to know and to learn, and especially both from a kind of research point of view, but also from a clinical point of view, because people who detransition don't go back to gender services. So really need a lot more to know about what can be done to support people who are working through these really complicated issues.
Yeah, gosh, that's really fascinating. It's kind of triggered off so many things in my head. I mean, that, it's kind of got the creative juices going, because if I'm right in understanding what you're saying, in a sense, this, in the context of stories, narratives about detransitioning, you're able to hold at once both stories about gender identity as well as stories about the materiality of sexed bodies, which I think is a really important aspect. That's really interesting. I understand that you may have a publication coming out soon. Is this, you were mentioning something about a piece of work to do with J Money?
Yes, so to do with John Money. So yeah, this came about because through my interest in transition and detransition kind of stories, I started to get really interested in the history of gender medicine and thinking about where all these ideas have come from. And then looking back at the history, these kind of origins of gender clinics, I realised that for the first time that this is also where the concept of gender itself was invented. And I didn't realise that before, because I had assumed, possibly even been taught, that gender was a feminist concept.
I was about to say, wasn't it a feminist concept? Wasn't it invented by Anne Oakley?
No, it wasn't. It was invented by John Money in 1955, and then it was adopted by the feminists. And so I found it really interesting. And I found it really interesting that it wasn't originating with feminists at all. So they adopted it as a way to talk about how the roles assigned to men and women are not natural and are historical and oppressive for women.
Yeah.
So basically to talk about the kind of social functions of sex or social elements of sex, and to separate these from the biological elements of sex. But actually it didn't originate there, and it also didn't originate in trans experience or theory either. So these two main places where we think of as being kind of about gender now, it doesn't come from either of them. So Money first started to use gender as not meaning a linguistic thing, so a gender of a word in French, for instance, in 1955. And then later, gender role, which was his concept, which morphed into gender identity, was adopted by doctors working with who were then known as transsexual people. So we can see this in the language as well, the move in from transsexualism to transgenderism. So originally, or back in the early 20th century, this was thought to be about sex, not gender. So, and the context in which John Money invented gender was actually that he was a psychologist working with people who are with what are variously called intersex or differences of sex development. And that's why he invented this idea of gender. So in this area, John Money is a pretty controversial figure. So, and that's because he advocated what Alice Drager talks about as the concealment approach, and that's where the aim was basically to disappear DSD, both physically and socially. So that involves picking a sex for a child at birth and then carrying out various interventions to produce what was viewed as a normatively sexed body. So just for an example, because so for instance, some girls are born with a condition where they have high levels of androgens, which mean that they have either a long clitoris or sometimes a small penis. And that's because the clitoris and the penis develop from the same structure and are kind of differentiated in development due to the presence of androgens. So because the girls have androgens, it can kind of go along the kind of male development pathway a bit. So for Money, this was a kind of seen as a problem, that these girls didn't have the kind of expected female body, if you like. So his approach was radical, and it would be to decide whether they were a girl or a boy, or going to be raised as a girl or a boy, and then either remove the girl's clitoris to raise them as a girl, if they had a long clitoris, or to keep the genitals intact because it looked like they had a penis, or they sometimes do have a penis, and raise the child as a boy. Okay, so that was the choice. There was no choice of just letting people live in their own bodies, apparently. So Money refers a lot. So for this paper, by the way, I looked back at all of his papers through to really investigate the kind of where gender was coming from and what function it had for him. And he, in those papers, all the way up to the 90s, he refers a lot to two cases where girls with the condition were raised as boys. And he was very proud of this because it kind of proved to him his idea that you could raise children in a particular gender role, no matter what their sex was. Right. So, but what he did was with these girls who had a kind of long clitoris, the children were given hormones in puberty so that their development was more male, and they also had their ovaries removed at puberty. So they didn't go through female puberty at all. So we can see that in this way of thinking, the interventions that he thought were appropriate for these children have major costs, either for sexual or reproductive function or both. So if the girls who were raised as girls were left without the ability to orgasm, and the girls who were raised as boys, can
I just interrupt? The girls who were raised as girls were in effect given clitoridectomies.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
And the ones who were raised as boys kept their genitals, but had their ovaries removed, so weren't able to have children.
Okay.
And women with this condition can not, I mean, have fertility difficulties, but can have children. So you can see here that this is an enormous commitment at great cost to the children's lives, to conceal the fact that some people have differences of sex development. So the idea was to raise children unambiguously as one sex or the other, and this was meant to be for their own psychological benefit, although that's extremely contentious, and certainly advocacy later by with intersex people who went through this kind of paradigm have challenged, you know, as you would imagine, challenged this extensively, highlighted the trauma involved in these interventions, as well as the silence and shame propagated by this way of thinking, because children were often not even told that this would be done at birth. So the idea was that we should just pretend that this doesn't happen. So John Money's approach is rightly out of fashion, although it's not eradicated. So some of these kind of procedures still take place. So I just wanted to explain the context that he was working in and what his concerns were and what kind of approach he was taking, because this is where gender came into the picture. And it seems odd, doesn't it? Where does gender fit into this? Well, so I think it's fascinating that John Money was so intensely motivated by eliminating ambiguity. So his work is full of this word. It's everywhere, all over his papers. So he saw DSD as a form of ambiguity. He also talks about people as a contradiction and as incongruous. And those are obviously horrible, like othering words to use about people's bodies. So we're all human beings. You can't be a contradiction with yourself. Obviously, what people are contradictions with are the kind of norms that he was trying to impose on them. But, you know, there's a big, long history of people with DSDs being talked about in those kind of pathologizing terms. And it's also in line with what, you know, a medical tendency to see difference as pathology, which is quite prominent. But this was certainly how Money viewed his patients. I think it's really important to understand that as representing a form of ambiguity which needed to be settled or sorted. And that's what he thought was his role, to definitively place these children in one category or another. And so flowing from that was that he was also concerned with knowing if his concealment approach worked, meaning how did he know that he had sorted his patients into the right category once he'd gone through all of this, once he put them through all of these interventions. So I think it's important to hold here that this is not a necessary question to ask. So if Money had seen DSD bodies as intrinsically valid, as imperfectly explainable within mechanisms of sex development, and people with DSD as valid human beings who should be supported to live good lives, then whether they are successfully seen as male or female is relevant, because they're just who they are. But it was this question which I think drove Money to create this concept of gender role, which he first talks about in 1955. And that's because he realised that when he tried to pick a sexed body for his patients, so when he tried to place them in one category or the other and make sure that they fit in those categories, he was also picking a social role for those for the patients as well. So this is in the 50s, so it's before feminism. This is before those roles were unpacked. So we didn't really.
They were still very naturalized, whereas seen as being flowing naturally from a particular body.
Yes, exactly. So that's, I mean, this is kind of where feminists tried to pass those things apart as much as possible. But at this point in the 50s, they were still very much seen as one thing. So Money's measure of success, has he gone the right way, boy or girl, was to see how well his patients adhered to the norms of their assigned sex, both in terms of interest and behaviour and personal identity. And it's this that he called gender role. Okay. And this was, So
go ahead. I'm just keeping half an eye on time, so we've got maybe about 3 or 4 minutes left. But
maybe. So his patients' bodies continued to be, from his point of view anyways, stupid point of view, kind of awkwardly ambiguous. So, you know, even if he managed to make somebody look like they were definitely a male, someone might still have like different chromosomes or something, and he saw that as a problem, as meaning they were still ambiguous.
Yeah.
But he could aim for complete coherence in role instead. So he kind of moved away from the body because it was kind of too messy, and aimed instead for this social coherence.
Yeah.
So he really did just uncritically accept the patriarchal norms for the sex when he was thinking about gender role. So I'm sure you can imagine what interests and characteristics there were, you know, rough and tumble play for boys, frills for girls, aggression and success for power for men, home and family for women, and for both, and this is really important, heterosexual marriage was the ultimate outcome.
So it really was the proper heteronormative patriarchal.
Yeah. We're talking like this is pre-feminism, it's the full patriarchal package. And he moving his same thinking over from the way that he thought about these people's bodies was that he saw any deviation from these role norms as incongruity in gender role. So, excuse me. And these are real examples in his papers. Examples of gender role incongruity include interest in careers for women and interest in the theatre for boys. There's a whole paper on theatre interest in boys. So
I'm sorry, am I actually betraying shock? Wow. Okay.
Yeah, no, it's pretty it's quite shocking reading it now. And thinking this was seen as sort of normal in the 50s and 60s. But the most important sign that gender role was not coherent or that had an incongruity for money was homosexuality. So, and it's really, it's not seen as, it's not about homophobia, it's just seen as, I mean, obviously it is homophobic, but it's seen as, well, this is just what fits together. So if you are gay,
it's because you're
in
gender.
Many's papers, it's a failure of gender role, and it means that the child was assigned to the wrong sex. That's
that's incredible. So I'm slightly aware of time. I also think that your voice may be running out of you. Can I just make one last comment, and then maybe we'll kind of wind up for this video cast. Isn't the wash of time something really interesting? Because where gender roles started, and the notion of a gender identity or gender role, is actually in a deeply pathologizing, place, please, if you need to cough, do. And yet where it ends up in the 21st century is in a very, very different place.
Yeah.
So I think, and that paper is about to be published now, is it, Laura?
Yeah, so I mean, it's about to be submitted. So, beginning of the publication. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right that once we go back and look at those, and it's just interesting, isn't it, that this concept has been adopted and moved through so many different ways of thinking. To
a very, very different political, I mean, here's a sociologist, to very, very different political effects in the social world as well. Laura, I'm going to stop you from talking anymore. I'm going to stop me from talking anymore. I'm going to say thank you very much. That I found that really interesting. I hope that the viewers out there in viewerland have also found that interesting. I look forward to hearing about when the paper gets published. I look forward to hearing more about the research on detransitioning. That just sounds like such a complicated and rich study. So keep us updated, and we'll keep the network updated. And at this point, I'm going to turn the recording off and say goodbye to everyone in viewing land. Goodbye.
Goodbye.